Thank you very much. Okay, thanks for coming. And I want to talk about the issue of microfinance. I'm sure you all have got some understanding. They've often said that microfinance is the one development policy that the average person in the street knows a little bit about. So I hope that people in universities and research departments, and particularly development studies, know a little bit more about it. So I want to talk about microfinance and why I think, for the most part, it's about an illusion of development. And that we really have gone in recent years from a situation of hubris, of great promises and great things, and we've moved on to a situation now where really we're talking about nemesis. So, so I want a little bit of a background of me. As very kindly said that I did a little bit of hitchhiking in my gap year, and then enjoyed it so much I actually stayed for 2 years and working in all sorts of places, and really enjoyed myself, and which was good because I was supposed to be going back to study geology, and I enjoyed myself so much and really got into issues of cooperatives and poverty and development that I ended up abandoning a geology degree and studying business and economics instead. So whether for good or whether I was a loss for geology or a gain for economics, I'll let other people decide. But so that's why I came into it, and I started work on a doctoral thesis on development in what was then Yugoslavia, soon became former Yugoslavia, looking at local development. Then I moved on to combine that with some consulting on policy, and then combine that with writing and researching. So a mixture of teaching, writing, researching, consulting. And I think that's quite a good background to give you an idea of whether policies work, what governments think about them, what ordinary practitioners think about them, what ordinary people think about policies. So, okay, so I don't know what you know about microfinance, but let's look at the start. I'm sure you've all heard of Muhammad Yunus, especially since I understand he came here in 2006 for the Microcredit Summit. Well, it's generally recognised that microfinance started with Muhammad Yunus, and his experiments, coming back from the United States, he began some experiments in the small village of Jobra near Chittagong. And Yunus looked at some experiments of microcredit that were ongoing in what was then Bangladesh and previously in East Pakistan and in India, and came up with a slightly modified version of microcredit, which he very successfully sold to the international development community, and they agreed to finance the development of this program. So he was very much arguing that microfinance will lead on to job creation, to income generation, to all sorts of good things, and the international community basically believed him. The foundation of micro enterprises established by microfinance, or we should more correctly, the term is microcredit, but we use microfinance nowadays because that's more recognized as the term, the more popular version. But Yunus argued that a supply of microcredit in the community, and you would soon be able to kickstart a bottom-up development dynamic created by informal micro-enterprises, income-generating enterprises, and self-employment. So that was his idea, and he set himself the task of trying to raise as much microfinance to try to kickstart this development process. Okay? And this is where the Grameen, the famous Grameen Bank, comes from. So he tapped the international donors, also tapped the Bangladesh government, he tapped the Norwegian government in particular for a lot of the finance to get the whole idea going. Microfinance at the time was also starting to appear elsewhere. We had, in Latin America, we had an individual called Hernando de Soto, who was very much lionizing the idea of informal micro-enterprises as the seed corn, the foundation for rapid poverty reduction in Latin America. Back in the 1980s, Latin America was very unequal, it had very high levels of poverty, poverty created very high levels of social violence, which fed into all sorts of political violence and guerrilla movements and all sorts of other nasty things. So De Soto was saying, very much like Yunus, that we needed lots and lots more informal micro-enterprises, and this would be the keystone to the development of Latin America. The United States government was very active in Latin America at the time for all sorts of military, political and economic reasons, and they very much saw a usefulness, just as they had in Bangladesh, and so they decided to support Hernando de Soto and his work, particularly in states like Bolivia, in setting up microfinance institutions to support informal micro-enterprises. So the idea initially, it's important, the idea initially was that microfinance was so important for development and poverty reduction that it was worthwhile subsidizing the idea. Okay? So governments and the international development community had no problem initially in subsidizing the Grameen Bank or in subsidizing other banks all around Latin America, in Asia, and then in Africa. So that wasn't the problem. The issue was that it was supposed to be producing a big impact in terms of jobs created, in terms of income, in terms of gender empowerment. So the cost was seen, in terms of subsidies, was seen as an investment. Okay? So there wasn't really a problem with that. Now, what started at this time, and selling, there's some famous claims made by Yunus, which with hindsight were probably unwise, because they set the bar very high for what microfinance was supposed to do. So the famous phrase that poverty will be eradicated in a generation. Our children will have to go to a poverty museum to see what all the fuss was about. De Soto was similarly claiming heroic entrepreneurs, they will power forward development in Latin America. So these were the sorts of phrases that were being bandied around in the 1980s in order to attract the attention of the international donors to provide the financing to get this great idea going. So there was an element of having to sell the idea of microfinance because you need the finance to actually get the idea going. And as we'll see, some of these claims were not just oversold, but even worse than that. Now, in the 1980s, we had a major political transition in the global economy. We had the election of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, we had the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States, and even though there was ideas about market fundamentalist or free market economics or neoliberalism, call it what you will, before these two individuals came along, when these two individuals came into power, the neoliberal political philosophy really managed to get into high gear. Okay? And this political philosophy was very much predicated on support for self-help, for individual entrepreneurship, which is the foundation of what we understand is neoclassical economics, that we don't need to have any form of collective action in poor communities. The poor don't need trade unions, they don't need social movements, and they most certainly don't need wealth and power redistribution. All they need is a microloan, and they will be able to get themselves out of poverty. Now, I hope you can understand that in the 1980s, that message was very, very powerful for those who were part of the neoliberal political philosophy. It was very central to their philosophy. But there was a problem, and the problem came in the form of the subsidies. Because neoliberalism, one of the foundational beliefs of neoliberalism, is that institutions such as companies, but also government departments, NGOs, football clubs, health services, call it whatever, should be financially self-sustaining. They should earn their own keep on the market. Okay? This was part of a mantra, an idea called full cost recovery. So this was very central to neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s. So clearly, microfinance was a little bit difficult to accommodate because it was based on subsidies coming in, And even though the outcome was supposedly very positive, the issue of subsidies coming in was a real problem for the main neoliberal organisations. So the message went out, we have to eradicate the subsidy element. The poor must pay the full cost of the microfinance that is supposedly getting them out of poverty. So leading the charge in terms of getting rid of these subsidies very clearly was the World Bank and USAID. And the way to do this was to turn microfinance into a business. Microfinance had to become a for-profit, commercialised, financially self-sustaining business. Okay? And so very much the whole Wall Street structure of incentives was brought into microfinance in order to make microfinance free to the country concerned. In other words, microfinance would in future be able to cover its costs because it was run like a business. Principally, that meant market-based interest rates. Interest rates set at such a level that they would be able to cover the costs of the operation. And this, it was thought, would lead to a massive increase in the supply of microfinance. Now, one of the justifications for this increase in supply was something called the absurd gap thesis. And this idea was that somehow all those millions and millions of self-employed people out there were just desperate for microcredit, and this would be the decisive intervention which would turn them from a struggling micro-enterprise or unemployed or in poverty into escaping their predicament. It turned out to be a bit of a deception, in fact a quite staggering deception, because most of the people who actually are in the self-employed community, they don't actually see a need for microcredit, but this was smoothed over. And the assumption was made that everybody working in the informal sector was wanting a microcredit, therefore the number one goal was to make sure that everybody had access to a microcredit. This whole idea of commercialisation was so powerful, it was irresistible, and even the Grameen Bank had to give in to the idea of commercialisation, and it converted itself into a commercialised provider with what was called the Grameen 2 project. So basically this was the future of microfinance. It was going to be a business, it was going to be about for-profit operation, it was going to be about market-based interest rates, and introducing all these Wall Street style bonus systems and incentive structures and share ownership for managers, you would convert it into a super efficient operation which would be churning out lots of microfinance for all the poor who were assumed to be just waiting there to receive their microloan in order to get out of poverty. So another example of hubris at this stage, because we were told that commercialisation will provide microcredit to all of the poor, and because of that we will have a historic period of poverty reduction. The so-called New World of Microfinance advocates, people like Marie Otero, Elizabeth Ryan, Marguerite Robinson, who promoted the idea, who were strongly behind the idea of commercialised microfinance, were promising fantastic poverty reduction gains were just around the corner. With this new idea in place, everything would fall into place in terms of poverty reduction. World Bank and SÍGUENOS, which is the consultative group to assist the poorest, they were saying the same thing along with USAID, that here in front of us, commercialised microfinance, we had a major new poverty reduction opportunity. It didn't turn out like that. Okay? Lots of rumblings in the late 1990s and 2000s from anthropologists, sociologists, political theorists, but generally the economics profession was fully behind microfinance. Looking back, I can't really see any major articles or statements that microfinance from an economic point of view was going to be problematic. Some stuff coming in from the anthropologists, some stuff coming in from the political scientists, but nothing really coming in from the economists. But we had a gathering storm because in spite of all the hype and the upbeat message, the microfinance industry wasn't providing any solid evidence that they were actually reducing poverty. By solid evidence, I mean impact evaluations or major independent surveys, or examples of regions or communities or localities clearly, manifestly getting out of poverty. What we had instead was evaluations undertaken by the microfinance institution itself. Okay? Isn't that strange? They would produce a positive impact result on their own activities. We had the microfinance advocacy industry, the World Bank, SEGAP, Green Foundation, Opportunity, Thinker, coming up with all sorts of studies which again showed there was some positive impact from microfinance. But independents couldn't find anything. So that was a problem. That was a problem. We also had another problem in the 1980s and 90s because it was apparent by then that here we had a clearly important historical model of development called the East Asian model. Starting with Japan, copied by South Korea and Taiwan, by Malaysia, Indonesia, then by China, and then the latest by Vietnam. So here we had a model that was working, manifestly working. And the problem was it had nothing to do with microfinance. So that was another awkward thing, that whenever they looked in the East Asian development model, microfinance really had nothing to do with it. So you were on shaky ground if you said we must have the microfinance model, because then people would say, well, East Asia is developing successfully without the requirement of having the microfinance model, so isn't that an awkward fact? And it clearly was an awkward fact. You had China's township and village enterprise movement, supported by cooperative, rural and urban credit cooperatives. You had Taiwan's small medium enterprise dominated economy, very, very successful. Then you had Vietnam's productive export-oriented family farms. They don't use microcredit, they use small farm credit. Something else. And obviously some of these lessons learned in the East Asian economies came from European and Italian and other experiences. Again, microfinance wasn't part of it. And then we had another problem, because the World Bank was starting to worry about the rising informality of the global economy in the 1990s and 2000. Instead of having formal sector jobs in private or public sector enterprises or government service, the way the world economy was evolving, and maybe a couple of days ago you saw an announcement by the ILO to this effect, but what we are getting was a gradual informalization of the world economy. We're getting jobs being created in the informal sector, which are minimum wage, ununionized, exploitative, long hours, etc., etc. And this was a problem. The World Bank even identified this as a problem. What the World Bank didn't say was that they were part of creating the problem because they had supported microfinance, which is universally associated with expanding and establishing the informal sector. So saying the informal sector was a problem is one thing, but without recognizing that they had actually funded the institutions that gave rise to the informal sector was something they weren't prepared to. That was a leap too far for them. In 2007 came, and I think even microfinance advocates will say this was the year when it really all started to go wrong. Okay? 2007. First of all, we had a big microfinance bank in Mexico called Compartamos, which had been started as an NGO, a non-governmental organization, using donor funding from USAID, with a couple of employees, who then became managers, who then became directors. And in 2007, they decided to take the company to the market, to have the initial public offering. So this was a big event in microfinance, and many in the microfinance industry praised it as this was the event. Microfinance has come of age. It's a business. Look at what's happening with Comportamos. Right, let's look at what happened with Compartamos. First thing, Compartamos was unable to identify any impact on poverty. Okay? There's no evidence that it has had any positive impact whatsoever. So that's the first thing. The second thing, with the IPO and the requirements for disclosure, we gained a lot of information about Compartamos that we weren't aware of beforehand. For example, the very, very large salaries of the senior directors. Okay? So there was a couple of evaluations of Compartamos, and they said, well, Compartamos is actually a very high cost institution compared to credit unions in Mexico. Why is it so high cost? And they had a look to see, is it because they're in locations where the rental costs are high, or is it because they're using very expensive cars or publicity? When they actually looked down, it was because of the fees and the salaries paid to the senior managers. So once people realised that, then wow, this is an institution supposedly helping the poor, but they are really operating like a bank and paying fantastic salaries. Then the IPO came, and the managers who bought into Compartamos bought in the shares, very often using interest-free loans, to buy shares in their own company, in their own institution, then made 10, possibly as much as $20 million each. Okay? This set off a storm of protest in the microfinance world and wider. This was not the sort of publicity that microfinance needed. This was an institution that had claimed to be about helping the poor, and when you actually looked at it, it was about helping a very small number of senior managers. So what did that remind you of? At least today, it reminds you of Wall Street. But this was in 2007, slightly before Wall Street came along. Okay? So this started a real problem for the microfinance industry. Next, we had some very accurate impact evaluations. They were called randomized control trials. Now, these are types of evaluation techniques which are the gold standard of evaluation. They're supposed to be very accurate. And also they were undertaken by independent academics, so not people within the microfinance industry. Although these people who did them were, by and large, you have to say they were supporters of microfinance. Less so nowadays, because these RCTs came out with almost no impact on poverty. Zero impact on poverty. So that was a big shock to the microfinance industry, because they'd hoped that it would bring positive results, that the more microfinance we pump in, the more poverty reduction we get out the other side. They couldn't prove that. They couldn't find anything. Okay? We then had other problems. We had a microfinance meltdown, a Wall Street-style meltdown, starting in Bolivia. Several institutions were desperate to get bigger, so that the managers could justify their pay packets getting bigger, so that they could move towards an IPO and get rich through an IPO. So all of the top ones were competing, throwing out as much microcredit as possible, and loading up the poor with more microcredit than they could actually productively service. So remember, going back when I said about the absurd gap that the poor are waiting for this microcredit, in actual fact they've got 3, then they've got 4, then they've got 5. Because these institutions are desperate to grow, so they take another one, pay off some of the earlier ones, but take another one. Now what does that remind you of? That's the subprime model. So this happened in Bolivia in 1999, and they said it was a one-off. It couldn't happen anywhere else. There were some specific factors there. The problem was it started happening elsewhere. Nicaragua exploded, Morocco exploded, Pakistan exploded. A country that I'm very familiar with, working a hell of a lot in Bosnia. We warned since 2005 when we heard people were just taking on more microloans than they knew what to do with, mainly to repay old ones. We said there's a crisis coming. Nobody listened because the big microfinance institutions just wanted to get as much microfinance out there so that they could get bigger, so they could pay themselves more, so that when the IPO came around they could make better terms and make themselves wealthier. Then we had the granddaddy of all microfinance meltdowns, the Andhra Pradesh crisis in India in 2010. So this was not one of the poorest states in India, but it was a middle-income state in India, and the microfinance institutions had targeted this particular state, and 4 institutions increased the supply of microfinance tremendously from 2006 onwards, 60 to 70% growth a year. This had absolutely nothing to do with poverty. This was about getting big. This was Wall Street. This was about getting big, raising their own salaries, getting even bigger, waiting for the eventual IPO. One microfinance institution in India managed to get to the IPO stage, an institution called SKS, run by a guy called Vikramakula, who wrote a book saying how his whole life had been dedicated towards helping the poor. When you look at his career, you realise this had absolutely nothing to do with it. Okay? When you look at the way, there's been several articles done on how when he was starting SKS and then he loaned himself an interest-free loan to buy in, then he gave the assets to the poor women in these groups for a temporary period, then he took it back from them, then he gave it to himself again, and then he did here, that, and then eventually, well, in the short, when it went to the IPO, he made himself approximately $30 million. So everybody in India knew this was not about poverty reduction, this was something else. So these were the problems we had in those days. So we get to Nemesis. This is the microfinance model ending. And there are 4 points I just want to emphasize here. Why? First one, when we actually look, most microfinance, most microcredit is not actually used for enterprise development. It's used for simple consumption spending. So what does that mean? That means the poor on a particular day or a particular week don't have an income stream coming in, so they take a small loan to buy food, to buy medicine. Maybe to have, they have to have a holiday, they have to buy something for a car or something. Okay? And you take a loan out. Okay? So it's nothing to do with enterprise development. And the problem with this is that microfinance is expensive. So the more the poor engage with microfinance as a consumption spending methodology, the more they are getting engaged with something that is going to, in the longer run, cost them. So at the end of the week, you have a budget, okay? How much the poor have spent. And then what they were finding in many of the countries was that at the end, there's this little item called interest repayment. And gradually over the weeks, over the months, that item started to increase. And so it goes to a point, and then the whole thing just collapses, because most of the income of the poor is spent on interest repayment. Nothing to do with helping the poor out of poverty. In Bosnia, they found that so many, up to 50% of the people in debt, nearly 50% of their disposable income was spent on servicing their microloans. Okay? 50% of their disposable income. Some very good papers done by institutions that support microfinance, not critical institutions. So what happened? They found it's a Ponzi scheme. The poor are taking in loans on one side in order to repay old loans. Okay? A bit like gambling. You lose, you bet on the horse, you lose, so you borrow some money to bet on it. No, if I win this horse, I'll make enough money that I can pay the old debt I have for the last horse I debt, and everything will be fine. Then you lose again. Oh God. Then you lend a third time. If I win this time, I can repay that, and I can repay. The poor get into that sort of dynamic. Okay? Nothing to do with poverty reduction. Second, the big problem in most communities, right from the 1970s onwards, has been a shortage of formal sector employment opportunities in government service or in big private industry. So what the poor do in the shortage, because they don't have a developed welfare social safety net, is you go into the informal sector. You buy and sell a few things, you do a bit of shuttle trading, you sell a few tomatoes on the street. That sort of activity is what you do when there are no other activities. So most villages in Bangladesh or in Malawi or in Bolivia already had lots of informal enterprises, none of them really doing very well. Okay? But along comes microfinance, and magically, if we create more of these informal enterprises, this is a way towards poverty reduction. Well, I hope you can see how that doesn't work. Because you can increase the supply of micro-enterprises, but there's a problem. You have to increase the demand for the goods, the simple items and services they provide. And there's no way that you can do that. That doesn't automatically follow if you increase the amount of basket makers in a particular village in Bangladesh, that you're automatically going to get the demand that actually absorbs these new baskets that come onto the market. It doesn't happen. Two things happen. One of them is called displacement. Okay? So when I get a microloan to set up a little basket making operation, I sell my 2 or 3 baskets a day only by taking the demand away from this basket maker who's been there labouring for 3 or 4 years, struggling away. This particular person loses most of their clients because the clients go over to me. So the net impact is pretty much zero. Okay? It's a redistribution of demand within the community. Okay? So there's no net impact. That's displacement. The second issue is failure. Many micro-enterprises that set up are set up not because the community has lots of demand waiting for them, but they're identifying there's profitable opportunities. These are what's called poverty push micro-enterprises. In other words, they are desperation driven and not opportunity pull. And so what that means is you're going into a market where you've got lots of other people doing exactly what you're doing, driving a rickshaw, selling tomatoes, whatever. And so what that means is that the failure rate of these new businesses is very high. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because very often you don't just use a microloan, okay? You take maybe $150 from Grameen Bank. Then you borrow some money from your brother to add to your little business. Then you take maybe a little scooter from your cousin and you put these all together. Maybe use a bit of land from your father-in-law, and that becomes your assets of your business, your bundle of assets. Now, when you fail, you don't just have the problem with the microloan, you lose all these other assets. And the problem then, of course, is once you lose this bundle of assets, you can be in much deeper and irretrievable poverty than before you even took the microloan. Now, it's a very widespread problem, but nobody wants to research it. The reason is, of course, because it's a downside. And researchers very often only want to research the upside. And particularly microfinance institutions and the development agencies, they want to research the positive things. They don't want to really delve into the issues which might suggest that microfinance wasn't working and the poor were actually worse off. Okay? So we don't see very much research on that. And the research that's done are done by people like myself. I've done a little bit. Other people, there's a couple of new projects starting out, looking at these issues of displacement and failure and finding that net impact is very often zero or negative for the poor. So what this means, we have something called the fallacy of composition. And this is a first year economics problem. And what that means is that you cannot extrapolate from one example to say that everybody does the same thing. So one basket maker that might be able to sell a few extra baskets in the community does not mean that everybody in the community can make baskets and they will sell them. Okay? It's called the fallacy of composition. Extrapolating from one case to say that every case will be similar because this one case to this one case. Okay? So that's a fundamental principle, and it's quite clear that Yunus either misunderstood it or chose to mislead others or whatever, we don't know. But he didn't understand that these communities were already pretty crowded with simple items and that really providing more would simply divide the demand between them, and really it was going to be very difficult to see that any gain was possible. Another issue is that very often people, microfinance advocates, will say that microfinance creates social capital, solidarity, trust, reciprocity within the community. In actual fact, it's the opposite. And particularly recently, because of the commercialization of microfinance model actually ends up destroying the bonds of trust that we have, particularly between poor communities and within poor communities. Why is that? Well, first of all, when you have commercialized providers, there is usually something that makes the poor repay, and it's called aggressive loan collection techniques. Okay, you set the bully boys out, you threaten them, you threaten to take their roofs off them, you take their land and all sorts of stuff. We've seen examples from Bangladesh to Bolivia, Bosnia. They send the bully boys round, they threaten you, they'll expose you. Basically, there's a lot of social and even worse types of pressure on you to repay your loan. You took it as a collateral-free loan in many cases, but when you default, you realise that it's not actually collateral-free. Oh my goodness, you've got to really pay it. Okay? And of course that means that in the community you're always living under the threat of these guys if you end up in default. So that the bonds of trust, the suspicion grow, and that becomes a problem. You then have what we call the microfinance millionaires. When microfinance started out, it was a development intervention that was going to reduce poverty. It was going to help the poor. When the poor start to see that the people who are getting themselves out of poverty are not the recipients of a microcredit, but the providers, that whole understanding just melts away. Okay? Once you see that the guys who are running the microcredit institutions are not just doing okay, nobody would begrudge anybody a decent salary, we're not saying that at all. But when people are making millions and becoming financial titans, becoming the richest person or the highest paid person in Bosnia or in Bangladesh, becoming multimillionaires, or in India, that then is the opposite. That's not poverty reduction. Okay? That's something else. And that destroys the links within the community, the social capital, the trust that you have. Another issue is that when microfinance institutions move out of even enterprise development, they move into things like consumer loans. Why do they do that? Because they think they're helping the poor more. Not really, because consumer loans are even less difficult to collect and less risky, and you can charge a higher interest rate. It's about what the market will bear. It's not about what actually the poor are wanting. And also what we see is that microfinance managers are very effective lobbying agents. They will push the government to deregulate the sector, to stop supervising them. Is this because they think they can provide a better service to the poor? Well, that would be really good if it happened. It's usually, the evidence shows, it's usually because it allows them to loot their own institution even more. Some of you might remember or have heard of the savings and loans crisis that the US government had, or the US had, in the 1980s. And there was a famous book written about it by a guy called William K. Black called The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And what he showed was these savings and loans institutions started out as financial cooperatives in the late 1800s with the wave of emigration from Europe and Scandinavia, so they were community-based institutions. The political philosophy changed in the 1970s, and professional managers came in and realized, whoa, I can make this my own. And they started to change it, pay themselves fantastic salaries, and justify the financial salaries by speculating. By the 1980s, the whole sector went bust, and it cost the US taxpayer $124 billion to restructure. Okay? Very similar dynamics are at play in the microfinance sector. Okay? Very, very similar dynamics. So we can't say we haven't been warned. Finally, we have to look at what microfinance does. Microfinance, ideally, when it's not consumption spending, microfinance supports informal microenterprises. And the problem here is that there is no historical experience that promoting informal microenterprises is associated with sustainable development or poverty reduction. In other words, the very thing that microfinance creates, an informal microenterprise, there's no evidence from anywhere that that's the basis for a sustainable local economy. It's the opposite. It's a way of going back in history. It's not a way forward. You can see that when you look at the African continent. Africa has more entrepreneurs than anywhere on the earth per capita. More people per 100 Africans are entrepreneurs than anywhere. It's a very high figure, something like 90 to 95% of African individuals are entrepreneurs. They have to be. They have to be, but that's the way you survive. And the problem in Africa is that those micro-entrepreneurs don't create the conditions for sustainable development. They are buying and selling. They are simple enterprises. These are not the foundations upon which we developed in the Western economies, and it's not the foundation upon which the East Asian economies, the miracle economies, developed from 1945 onwards. Okay? So we're building the complete opposite foundation for sustainable development and poverty reduction. A fantastic book to read on that is by a guy, a Cambridge professor called Ha-Joon Chang. You could start with 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism. It explains why development and how development takes place, shows that there's no role for microfinance or for microenterprises. Or his previous book in 2007, Bad Samaritans, explains why much of the advice we gave the developing economies wasn't to help them, it was more to help us. So that's a good example of what the problems are. Not just in Africa, the Inter-American Development Bank just came out with a report in 2010 called The Age of Productivity. And this was looking at why is Latin America mired in poverty, has been since really the 60s, 70s, inequality, social and political violence. What's the reason for that? And the Inter-American Development Bank said because, very simple, it's not because of a lack of foreign direct investment from the USA, it's because what financial resources Latin America has, it has invested them into informal micro-enterprises and self-employment, and so not invested them in more sustainable, innovative, formal sector enterprises. That's their core conclusion as to why Latin America is in poverty. They've put too much emphasis on micro-enterprises and not enough emphasis on formal sector businesses. So just one quote in their conclusion. Unlike other regions of the world, the overwhelming presence of small companies and self-employed workers in Latin America is a sign of failure, not of success. So that's not what we've been told. All these micro-enterprises, surely Latin America is getting out of poverty. The Inter-American Development Bank is a mainstream development bank, not some radical leftist organisation. So that was their core concern. Finally, in a place like Bosnia, since Bosnia under former Yugoslavia was a quite advanced economy with some big companies, they had export contracts in the Middle East for some quite high-tech goods and services, military equipment, construction equipment. So it wasn't a rich economy, but it certainly wasn't a developing economy as we traditionally understand. The war came, and at the end of the war they wanted to reconstruct. And Bosnian politicians said, right, we need to develop our businesses, we've got some good innovation, we have technologies. All those things were ignored. They said, no, Bosnia is going to be the test case for microfinance, post-conflict microfinance. So the World Bank came in, set up these programs, the Local Initiatives Project, the UNDP came in, KFW, the DFID, all the institutions, the development institutions came in. And Bosnia became the centre for microfinance in the world. Nowadays it's second only to Bangladesh in terms of the penetration. What do Bosnians, many Bosnians call it Africanization, Africanization of their economy. Okay? They now have streets lined with people selling tomatoes, little kiosks everywhere selling beer, Fanta, Coca-Cola, small businesses with selling mobile phone time, selling odds and bits and bats. In other words, Bosnians say they wanted after the war to move towards Brussels and a modern, advanced, wealthy economy, and instead they've moved towards Bangladesh. They call it Africanization, many people there. So that clearly was a problem. Okay, coming to the end. So I've not said very nice things about microfinance. I'm not really a supporter, as you can gather. But then somebody will always say, well look, if microfinance is so bad, and you can see that it's so bad, why on earth has it survived? Why on earth is it still supported? And you have to say that, well, it's not the economics, it's the politics. Okay? Just a few things. First, as I said, self-help, individual entrepreneurship, these are core features within Washington and the global neoliberal economy. These are core things they want to see. Microfinance supports these outcomes. Microfinance celebrates these outcomes. So it has to stay. Regardless of whether it's working or not, the poor have to understand that the only way out of poverty in all these developing countries is through individual entrepreneurship and self-help. Not through trade unions, not through social movements, Not through wealth and income redistribution, heaven help that they were thinking of that. Not through things like communism, socialism, or whatever collective movements. It's through self-help and doing the things themselves. That way we can sleep better at night. Okay? They've got the tools, and they don't need to ask us for anything. And they don't need to start thinking about things which are going to upset us. We don't want to see... The World Bank's never supported a trade union, so far as I've ever heard. So they're not going to start now. So it delegitimizes all forms of collective action. And yet, the history of the Western economies is that we got out of poverty through collective action. Through governments that invested in education and technology. Through trade unions that made sure that we had to pay decent wages so that we could bring technology into the workplace. Through all sorts of things like healthcare, so that we didn't have to worry about whether we became sick. We had healthcare available. Okay? All those things that made us wealthy, and then later on the East Asian economies, that's how we became wealthy. The last thing we want is to see maybe these developing countries using the same sort of techniques to get themselves out of poverty. They must stick to market solutions. So it's one rule for us and one rule for them. Ha-Joon Chang, just to go back, has a book out called Kicking Away the Ladder. Basically, we became rich through collective forms. We developed big enterprises, we gave technology, we had a great education system. But then when it came to other developing economies, we gave them the pure market model. Even though we never used it at all. When you look at the US economy, when you look at the UK economy, Europe in general. In many cases, governments like to use microfinance because they can cut public expenditure. Many times a colleague of mine heard in India, why don't we have good sanitation facilities paid for with taxes? Oh, we're not going to pay for those things. The poor, they've got microfinance. They can find a private provider. Brilliant. Governments can stand back, not tax the middle class, and say, look, we are helping the poor. They've got microfinance. What's their problem? They can, if they want sanitation or toilets or clean running water, they can get it. It's passing the responsibility back to the poor. So the poor don't need welfare. They don't need welfare support. They need microfinance, and then everything will work out for them. So those are the political ideology reasons. There's also a more prosaic reason. The microfinance sector now is a big edifice. It's got institutions providing credit, advocating credit, researching microcredit. All those institutions, if we were to say, well, it simply doesn't work, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with the people who have committed their career to microfinance? What are we going to do with all the advisors? Okay? So they fight back. They fight, no, microfinance has a role. One of the ways they do it is they say, okay, it never resolves poverty, but we can think of something else it can do. It can, financial inclusion. Every poor person must have access to a bank. So that's what we're passionately involved with now. If you listen to the World Bank, we want financial inclusion. No evidence provided whether this is a better strategy than any other strategy, but it's something they can passionately commit to, and that keeps the whole ball rolling a little bit further. Okay? Now, okay, so I'm a bit of a bummer on microfinance. Okay? There must be alternatives. Well, very clearly there are. I talked earlier that most microfinance is actually used for consumption spending. Well, the alternative institution exists. It's worked very well. It's called a credit union. Non-profit, or in some countries for-profit, but managed by the community, for the community. They provide small-scale capital without any hassle. Nobody gets rich running them, but they provide the community service. Not a problem. Not a problem. You don't need to bring in expensive microfinance, possibly owned and controlled by shareholders back on Wall Street, as in many cases. If we're talking about enterprise development, which is the core of development, we need good, solid, functioning enterprises which can grow and employ and pay good wages. Well, the best way to support those particular enterprises and to identify them are things like local banks. Many countries have solid local banks that work to provide finance to good potential business projects. One of the Italians called this the theory of the local bank. A guy called Giacomo Beccattini looked at how Italian local banks work, and they understand their clients, and they support good, solid businesses. They don't risk their savers' money. And he said every local community or region needs a good, solid bank with roots in the community, not internationally, doing all sorts of speculation and treasuries and derivatives, but working in the community. So local banks, we go back to that. Financial cooperatives. The Basque region in Spain has a fantastic financial cooperative that works, a community development bank that works setting up new enterprises. This is not a secret. We know how to do these things. Community development banks. Many countries have banks set up, some public, some private, public-private partnerships in many cases. But they work to provide the resources to businesses that will have the potential to grow. Another aspect, I mentioned that microfinance is the umbrella term for lots of other things like microcredit, micro-savings, micro-leasing, and all the other things. Well, another area that's developing now is this issue of micro-savings. Maybe the poor need to save rather than take an expensive micro-debt. That's catching on now. So that's an alternative. Instead of encouraging the poor into debt, we should be encouraging them and developing the institutions that they can save. Okay? That might be a better way forward if we really want to help them. If we want to make money from them, then we should carry on giving them microcredit. Another technique in many parts of Latin America they're developing now is the poor need small sums of money, but maybe not a debt. Why not just give them a sum of money? It's called a conditional cash transfer. Okay? CCTs. You get $30 a month in return for taking your kids to the health clinic, or for making sure they go to school, or something like that. Getting very popular now. In some countries, they don't even make it conditional. You just get a standard piece of cash. Now, the value of those things is that the poor, by definition, are without a lot of income. So this $30 or $40 a month allows them to not have to go out onto the street to sell tomatoes, but they stay at home and they have other domestic responsibilities. And I don't mean just in gender terms, it could be a man or it could be a woman. And they can stay at home, they can have other things. Okay? We don't need to force them out into the street to sell some tomatoes, often for just a few pennies a day profit. And in fact, actually, when you give them a small cash grant, very often voluntarily they don't go out onto the street. Why would they? The value of that 10, 15, 20 cents a day that they used to make is a lot less now that they've got $30. When they have zero amount of money, then you have to go out onto the street to make 50 cents a day. As soon as you give them $30, the value of that 50 cents a day is much, much less, so they shy away from it. So that's also an indication of how unproductive these activities are, how degrading and demeaning they are. Give a poor person $30 and they immediately step out from it. We want nothing to do with that. So these are things in Latin America that are having a very positive impact. And I think they contain the potential for poverty reduction a lot more than the standard microfinance model. Last slide. So, what's the conclusion? Yeah, well, I've been a bit of a downer on microfinance, to be honest. It started with good ideas. I fully admit that many of the people behind it had good intentions. But sometimes good intentions are harder to change and to challenge than bad intentions. When people think I'm doing good, it's really hard to argue with somebody. If they say, well, no, I don't care, I might be doing bad, but I want the money. It's harder to argue with somebody who thinks they're doing good. But it was a fundamentally flawed idea, as we are seeing now. When it was then commercialized in the 1990s, when it became a business, then that destroyed entirely the concept. It then became a money-making activity, and instead of providing the resources into poor communities that they could use to get better, it's actually more about looting resources from the poorest communities. When you have a bank in Mexico, Compartamos, that works in some of the poorest regions in Mexico and charges 195% interest rates on its microloans. Its shareholders, in many cases, are pension funds and hedge funds on Wall Street, who are getting good dividends from Compartamos. There's something wrong with that. Most people now realise there's something wrong with that model. As I say, the neoliberal ideological revolution was very important in first catalysing this idea into place and financing it, and then keeping the wheels on the vehicle as it went through when it became clear that it wasn't actually working to resolve poverty. Ideologically, it was very powerful. In fact, you can look at a study that just came out last year by Maren Duvendak and colleagues. You can just Google that, Maren Duvendak Systematic Review. A big study looking at has microfinance had a positive impact on the poor. Their conclusion, looking at all the evidence, all the impact evaluations, was that there is no evidence accumulated in 30 years that it's had a positive impact. And their conclusion was that economics doesn't explain microfinance, politics explains the popularity of microfinance. Okay? So today microfinance is increasingly accepted. It's an anti-development intervention. It works in most cases to undermine the struggle against poverty and undermine the struggle to establish sustainable communities. The main development agencies are taking note. They're slowly, edgily, carefully moving into other fields. They can't go too fast because then somebody like me will start asking questions, why were they doing it in the first place? But policies change, policies evolve, we make mistakes, we learn, we move on. And the development agencies are moving on, and they're moving to something called the missing middle problem. So those small businesses, medium businesses in the middle, which in many cases are the bedrock of an economy, a successful economy, they're moving to the question of how do we establish those. We can't work with big enterprises on the one hand, and we don't want to work with informal micro-enterprises on the other. We want to work with those small businesses in the middle. So the issue is now is how do we finance and support and promote and nourish those businesses. And also, as I said, many of the development agencies are abandoning microfinance and working on these cash grant programs. In Latin America, these cash grant programs are run by governments, but they're also, the World Bank even has got involved and is supporting them and providing technical assistance. So that's where we're sort of moving out of microfinance and moving into these other areas. So I hope I haven't been entirely positive here. I hope I've given some idea about what I feel is the case in microfinance. And if anybody has any questions or queries, I think now is the time for that. Thanks for listening anyway.